My name is Bob Truby, and I'm the director of the Emerging Scholars Network. And one of the things that we've become more and more aware of are the number of disabled students on our university campuses. And we've seen estimates that range between 12 and 25% of adults on our campuses are there with disabilities. And we want to talk about how we might welcome and include those students in our faculty and student communities on campus. I'm talking today with Deborah Meyer Abbs, and Deborah's disability and inclusion and access specialist for Intervarsity in Indiana and Illinois. And I really appreciate her taking the time to be with us.
Thanks for having me, Bob. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, Debbie, I thought we might start with just your own story, because I think that's pretty integral to the ministry you're engaged in.
For sure. So I think I started out like a lot of us in terms of not really seeing or thinking about folks with disabilities to my detriment, and but that was true for me. And it wasn't, and so that impacted my campus work in the 90s when I was on campus, because I didn't really think about that group on campus. But after my boys were born, I have a son who's in college, a senior, and then I have Brandon, and then I have Luke, who is just turned 17. And when Luke was about 2.5, Bob, he started to regress, and he started to lose his words, lose his speech. And I remember the last word that he had was more, and he would just keep saying more and more and more. And it was a very stressful time for us. And he got diagnosed with autism, and so that was really God's way. So he's 17, so that's when he was 3. So it's been about 14 years for me of that my Luke started me on this journey of having a heart and passion for this often marginalized and overlooked group that we miss out on. So, and it's grown from there in terms of building more friendships and just learning as I go, and God calling me and wanting me, I think, back on campus as I went back on 2 years ago, pre-COVID, to focus on this disability inclusive ministry. So.
Well, yeah. Well, when we talk about disabilities, what kinds of conditions are we speaking about?
Well, it's interesting because you'll get maybe some different answers from different people. So this might not be a complete thing, but I think some different categories that I found with my students are those that have physical disabilities, intellectual disabilities, that are neurodiverse, like autism or ADHD, and those can be more of the invisible disabilities that we can't see when we look at a person. And then I think mental health actually can fall in this disability category as well at times, as well as there's sensory processing issues that fall into the category. So it's very broad, very diverse.
Yeah, I could see that. And when you talk about the breadth of different disabilities, roughly I mentioned some statistics at the beginning, but maybe talk a little bit more about the prevalence that we're seeing on university campuses of disabilities.
Well, according to I can't remember what the according to the National Center of Education Statistics, and this is pre-COVID, so I don't think they've come out with a new one yet, but 19% of undergraduate students have a documented disability. So that could even be higher for people where the university doesn't know, and they're not seeking support. And 12% of graduate students and professional students have a documented disability. And then that stat you gave at the beginning, in the United States, there's 1 in 4 or 6 million adults with disabilities. So it's a huge underreached, really an underserved group of people.
Well, I know when I think about administrating a campus, I often think about all the different corners that we want to try to welcome and include on our
Yes,
campuses. And
yes.
this is a big one.
It's a huge, isn't it? I think it's the largest, Bob, it's the largest minority group because all the other minority groups fall within it.
Wow.
Right. And it's also the only minority group where we're not born into it. I mean, we can be impacted by disability at any age, right?
Right, right.
It's really large.
Yeah, it certainly is a significant group of people
Mm-hmm. Yep.
that are on our campuses, that our campuses have actually worked to make accommodations for and so forth.
Yep.
You're working in kind of leading InterVarsity's initiatives in working with disabled students. Tell me a little bit about what that's involved for you.
Oh my goodness. Well, I guess what I'll say is I think about a year ago at this time. So, well, first let me go back a few years.
Mhm.
I was working in admin for a number of years. And so several years back, I asked my supervisor, can I also start writing for InterVarsity's blog and writing things and creating 3x3s and just raising awareness of this underserved part of campus? And he said yes. So that, there's baby steps along the way. But then when I went back on campus pre-COVID, I was at a community college. I know that's not graduate students, but there are faculty there.
Mhm.
And I was hired, and I'm in Illinois, in Indiana region. And so it's College of DuPage, and I was hired to focus on including students with disabilities. And so it was alongside these students and with my wonderful planting coach supervisor and my other supervisor I started hanging out on campus and getting to know this population. And for me, what it looked like there, and then I'll talk about what's happened in the last year, but there, many schools, I think about 700, more than 700, have 2-year certificate programs for those with intellectual disabilities.
Mhm.
And at COD, these awesome students had the same lunch hour, every 2 days a week. I would see them. They're having lunch in the cafeteria. And so myself and some students just started hanging out with them. And I sort of also kind of would, when we had our NSO tables, I kind of would be keeping my eye out for people too. But this is how friendships were built. And then we decided to call the group Access InterVarsity, and we met a couple times, and then COVID happened. So last year, this time, Bob, I think it was August, my supervisor, Colleen Deegan, and my planting coach, Phil Nortwick, Phil said to me, I think we should try virtual meetings, Deb. I want you to gather partners and see what happens. And so I don't think he knew that because of connections, Urbana 2018, they allowed us to have a sensory lounge in. So students that were overwhelmed I set up a sensory lounge in the room they gave, and students that were overwhelmed by the loud plenary session could come in, and there was fidgets and weighted blankets and that kind of thing in there. So at that Urbana, we met a lot of students and some adults too that came to Urbana. And so because of that, the partners that I gathered to kind of launch Access InterVarsity virtually were from around the country, not just our region. So when after the meeting, I was like, well, I guess this is more of a national thing. So that's kind of how that happened. And then the virtual spaces they were just well received and kind of took off from there. So we did fall semester, we did, I think 6 virtual meetings. And then at Ambition, they showed one of our awesome students, her story about disability identity and some of the things she faced on campus. And we did more in the spring semester. And now we're gonna, so now there's been people that want to plant this on their individual campuses. So that's what I'm praying for. But we're going to also relaunch our virtual space here in a couple weeks.
Excellent, excellent. Well, please let us know about ways that we can get that word out in GFM circles, because
Oh, awesome. Okay.
yeah, because as you mentioned, there's a significant population of graduate students and faculty as well
Mhm.
who
Yep.
might appreciate a connection with that. Well, as you've been involved in this work and working with university chapters on inclusion of disabled students, what are some of the barriers that disabled students encounter when they come to our groups?
Yeah. You know, I think it's both, Bob. It's both coming to our groups and then also our campuses at times.
Hmm.
Even though the Americans with Disability Act, the ADA, was passed relatively recently in 1990, it's not always followed. So, one of my students on campus really wanted to not have to go way across campus to the accessible bathroom that didn't have a door that that he couldn't open in his chair.
Mm.
So he was asking the disability, the accommodations office for, like the things that hold the doors open, small things. I think what I want to say, sorry, I'm giving us a little example here, is that our students have both obstacles with architecture, maybe, and with attitudes of ableism or just hidden biases. So in our chapters, um, I think that in one sense, we can think about we always want to welcome every student. But I think as we think about this population, that we need to know that there's obstacles and attitudes that sometimes prevent, being included. Can I share one example from?
Absolutely.
Awesome. Okay. So I talked to a law student this week, and she is where's she at? She's in North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And she became a Christian through Intervarsity. There's even a video, she said, this is back around 2010 originally when she was an undergraduate. She moved out of from Islam to accepting Jesus. And she said it was because her chapter was so welcoming and loving compared to her prior experience. She also, I'm sorry, she wouldn't, she said, fine, share whatever. And her name is fine, Chelsea. She's now at Thomas Cooley Law School, which I think is in Michigan. But so she loves InterVarsity, but then she also wants it to move forward because of some of her experiences in the chapter. I think a lot of it is lack of knowledge or lack of sensitivity. She brought up to others that she wanted to try to reach out to other students that were blind. And someone said, well, that'd be really weird to have a lot of blind people in our group. That's not great. She went on a GP global project to China, and she loved it. But then one of the leaders said, well, it's great that this worked. Maybe we could try it again sometime, meaning that she had the whole world she had to represent. She had the pressure of representing everyone with disabilities. That's not what you want. So I don't know. I guess those are some obstacles, specific examples that I think of.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the term ableism, and I wondered if you might talk a little bit about some of the ways that manifests or could manifest in our groups.
Yeah, well, ableism, if you've never heard the term, it basically means the discrimination or social prejudice against a whole group of people, those with disabilities. Similar to racism, sexism in that vein, but I don't think we hear the term that often. One of the things that my students say is that both in social justice and in our Christian spaces where Jesus marginalized, this ism is like invisible. Bob, did I lose you?
You broke up there a little bit.
Bob, I'm sorry. Okay. So
I think we're okay
now
now.
I can't even remember the question you asked. Okay. Can you re-ask that question for me?
Sure. Yeah. You mentioned ableism, And I
Yes.
wonder just what are some of the ways that that might manifest
Yeah.
in our communities.
Yes. You know what? I think that hidden biases, I think that we all have. It doesn't have to be
Mhm.
necessarily the prejudice. There are prejudices, and I've experienced them with my son. But I think some of our hidden biases, and one could be, you know what, if you, and this has happened to friends of mine in wheelchairs, like this brilliant law student I talk with, because she's in a wheelchair, people make a hidden bias assumption that she's not smart, because you have a
Mhm.
physical disability. That
Mhm.
could be one thing. Um, it could be just a matter of small things, like at our feeling excluded and not seen at our large groups or conferences because the worship leader says stand now instead of stand if you're able. So there's some language pieces that we
Yeah.
can learn and small things that we can do. Um, it can be having sometimes large groups meet off campus in in places that are not accessible. So it's happened before that students in wheelchairs have had to crawl upstairs. Um, Even my faculty friend, who I talked to this week, is an OT professor, and her staff team met off campus twice, and she had to crawl in. So it can be architecture that we have to be aware of. It can be language and trying to have some inclusive language, just something simple like saying stand if you're able, or um, you know, sometimes if we say raise our hands, it might mean saying use the feature if we're on Zoom of the reaction feature. That might be easier. So there's little things that can help, I think.
It sounds like a lot of it is just being, the consciousness of who's in the room.
Yes. So yeah, it is. And so it really is simple in that way of, you know what? Get to know get to know these students and faculty like you would everybody else. Same way. Ask questions. Don't be afraid to ask questions and get to know the person.
Mhm.
Then you'll know what their experience is.
There's also the issue, there was a book I think written in another context talking about when helping hurts. And
Ah,
there are probably helpful ways to be
yes,
helpful and
yes,
ways to not be helpful when we're trying
yes,
to help. I wonder if you might talk a little bit about that
yes.
in your own experience.
Yeah, I think that the things that we are not helpful is when we might assume an accommodation that a person needs. So, for example, one of the staff volunteers on a campus and who's helping Pioneer Access, she had professors who would um, do things automatically for her that she didn't really want help with, instead of just asking and looking at her accommodation papers and going with that. So I guess not making assumptions, but asking a person what they want. Another thing that maybe to avoid is just to watch our language and ask. It's tough in the autism community. We've got people who want to be called autistic. That's their big identity. And then they've got in education, it's not, it's person first language of saying having autism. So it really also depends on the person with the disability. So it's asking and deferring, coming in as a learner and then deferring to the people that you're getting to know.
Hmm. I really like that. That that makes sense. Um, have you we often talk about sort of the barriers and challenges and steps we need to take. But what are some of the ways that you've seen students with disabilities be gifts to
Oh,
students and faculty be gifts to
oh,
communities?
oh, there's too many ways to count. In fact, I, the kingdom of God isn't represented fully when they're not there. My students are so smart, and you can't say for everybody, but I'll say for they you bring a unique perspective. One of our staff volunteers in Wisconsin, he he's a total prayer warrior. So what I want to say is this people group, they're our co-laborers, and they're given spiritual gifts just like the rest of us. And they're not necessarily unique gifts necessarily. They're the gifts that the Bible talks about being spiritual gifts. But because of some of the things they've been through and their experiences of maybe hardship and suffering, they might have a deeper faith because they've had to rely on God more. I know I have personally, not only with my son, but with some of my mental health challenges. So when we have extra challenges or extra suffering that we're wondering about that comes into our life, we can develop a deeper hold on him, and he displays a deeper hold on us at times.
You remind me of we had a law student in our community several years ago at Ohio State who was blind. And one of the most amazing things about her, she was on our leadership team for a while, and just
that's so cool, Bob.
was just awesome and really helped us to become more aware of welcoming disabled students. But one of the things that was striking about her was, even though she couldn't see us, she knew who wasn't in the room, and would often be the person who would email somebody or call them up and say, "Hey, haven't seen you for a while. Can we grab coffee?" You know? And
like the mercy, compassionate one. And yeah.
I mean, and it was
That's
wonderful.
amazing.
Even though she couldn't, it was she was often the one who was aware of who wasn't there. And it was such a gift to us in building connectedness and community.
That's awesome. That's really here.
Yeah. And well, you have recently published a book or a study guide with Intervarsity Press, and we're going to show people the guide in a minute, but I wonder if you might just tell us a little bit about that.
Well, originally the belonging, the study guide was written for a student who's now a volunteer staff and work as an access leader, who she wanted to have a small group. This is when she was a student leader, for students that had physical disabilities like herself. And so she brought up some topics of, needing to forgive, or needing, what does healing really look like? It's not really just, heal my eyesight, but it's spiritual healing. And so some of the studies came out of that. And my hope for it is just really that there might be some inclusive groups studying it together, small groups, those with and without disabilities, integrated groups, or people that haven't really thought about accessibility or inclusion, disability inclusion at all. And I talk some, about my story and my son's story in the intro sections, and the main intro I really like that on the first couple pages. So yeah, so I have some of the scriptures passages. I don't know if you want to know those, but
I'll tell you what, I'm going to put the book up on the screen, and
awesome.
so that everybody who's watching this can see it.
Thanks.
Okay, so there's the table of contents and a link to it. So and a picture of the book.
Look at you. That's so cool. I need something like that.
I'll send you the slide.
Awesome.
But at any rate, if why don't you tell us, just as we have that up here, you can just tell us a few things about the contents and some of the things that you get into.
Well, I wanted to I wanted the first study to really be about our true place of belonging and inclusion is with Jesus. So that's kind of how I went. And I think the God created us and knows us is because often those with disabilities have internalized ableism, right? That maybe the culture looks down on on them, and they've internalized that. And so talking just about how Psalm 139 and how God created us and made us fearfully and wonderfully seemed a good thing. I really like the story of 2 Samuel, just with David bringing Jonathan's son to the table, as we all need to be. And one of my favorites passages that has been for a long time is the healing of the paralytic, because it has so many elements of the place wasn't accessible. The person that was paralyzed, the paralytic man, had to take a huge risk to allow his friends even to be seen near Jesus, in that culture, when illness could be seen as a curse by God, and also the friends persevering and getting there. So both of them, I really love that passage, and I love how Jesus sees the real need of spiritual healing and forgiveness is the main healing, not assuming what other kind of healing is needed for somebody, so anyway, those are some thoughts. And then, I really wanted to have something about spiritual gifts in there, because there is not a footnote in the Bible that says, different categories of people don't have these spiritual gifts. All the spiritual gifts we all have them as we know Christ. And so I really wanted to have that included as well.
Well, the study guide is one of Intervarsity's Life Guide Bible studies that just came out this summer. And anybody who is interested in getting it can order it from Intervarsity Press. And the link is here on the slide. And also, you could pick it up at your local Christian bookstores. But well, with that, I'll take this off. And
Okay.
and Deb, just any last words that you want to share of encouragement to people who are watching?
Yes, I don't know, new things can feel scary, or things we don't know about, right?
Yeah.
But I guess, we don't need to know everything. I certainly don't know everything. And so just to continually ask God to see people from how he values people, not the perfect shiny people that we might, and our organizations might, put the money towards or the resources towards. All people that are marginalized, and specifically those with disabilities, have so much to give to us, to all of us, and the kingdom of God is not complete without all of us. So
Deborah, thank you so much for joining us today, and for taking the time for this conversation. I hope it opens eyes for many of us in opportunities to welcome people who are on our campus, maybe are even trying to get in, as it were, and to make that easier and more joyful for them and for us, because these people also really bring gifts into our communities. Thank you so much.
oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.